Welcome to the Virtual Excellence Show, where we speak to amazing people to understand how to be excellent in the world things virtual. And today we have Lee Bryant, who has an extraordinary history in connected organizations and how they function well. I've known Lee for well over a decade, and he'll share some insights on the 21st century organizational operating system and how to be able to drive that. So fantastic to have you with us, Lee.
Hi, Ross. Nice to be here.
So we knew of each other, I think, when there was a term called Enterprise 2.0 or 2.0, depending on which continent you were on. And I love that phrase because it was this idea of not just Web 2 in the enterprise, but also, for me, the next version of organizations. And just love to hear your reflections of sort of what's happened since that time for you and your journey. And I presume you're still in the same vein at the moment, but having moved on, progressed.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, to look back at that period, because I think we had a lot of hopes. We had some really high hopes that this new wave of sort of social technology would, humanize the enterprise, would sort of change the structure of the way that we do work in organizations. And I think what's interesting is that to some extent that was true and that succeeded, but at the same time, I think it ignored the deep inertia and the sort of center of gravity that exists around, hierarchical bureaucratic management in organizations. And, as people say about markets, markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And I think, management cultures can stay irrational much longer than a small consulting firm can change them. So I think there are, positives and negatives. I think for us, where the journey went was that, we sort of were early pioneers in this area before Facebook, before these sort of mega platforms emerged. Then we grew, relatively large, and then we sold the company and so on. And I think when we reflected after that journey, we realized that we had not achieved our goal fundamentally. So we still had a mission to pursue. And really that mission was to tackle the problem, not from the sort of technology point of view, but really from the model and the theory point of view. So in other words, find realistic, viable alternatives to, hierarchical management, and then work our way towards trying to popularize those and implement them. And that's really what we're involved in today.
So you were just telling me that you are no longer in London where you were before. I think I visited you somewhere in the Thames somewhere, I think. So now you've moved.
Yeah, so I, as you may have read, the UK did this sort of spectacular political own goal. They, as I would describe it, they opened the moron portal and gave lots of bad actors the chance to sort of influence people in a very negative direction and try and shut down the country, close off from Europe, all this nonsense. And so obviously I was, that's against all of my sort of instincts and my principles. And so when it was clear that couldn't be reversed, we moved the family over to Portugal, which is a fantastic, modern, progressive country that's trying to improve things rather than go backwards. And I'm, deeply grateful as a sort of, if you like, a Brexit refugee that they took us in. But, to me, it's almost symbolic, because if you look at the US elections that have been going on last night, and you look at Brexit, you look at some of the other sort of emerging authoritarian figures in the world, you realize that we are still witnessing the sort of slow death of the 20th century. And actually we're at a sort of critical point where things can go backwards rather than forwards. We shouldn't assume that progress is a given. And this, to me is what I also experience in my work, because, I've worked with some very non-performing, almost dysfunctional management hierarchies, and made the case from everything from sort of economic case, the ROI case, the sort of principal case, the employee customer engagement case. And, these systems are not dead yet. And these systems, in a way, are getting more entrenched in some companies and in some industries, because that's often a response to uncertainty and change that people don't understand. So to me, I see all of these things as being connected. And I think what brings them together and what really drives me at this stage in my career is we desperately need institutions which are fit for the 21st century. And I think those institutions need to sort of embody, the good, the decent, values that I think probably still the majority of people hold, give them longevity and protect them, but also be organized in a way that, is sort of digitally literate, that understands the affordances and superpowers that digital tech gives us, but in a way that's also very human. And so, if I look at these situations around the world, I think they're largely a product of institutional failure. I think what actually happened was, we've come from a political class and a management class where we believed that they would fundamentally act in the interests of, the body politic or the country or the company or the organization. But actually, we didn't have enough rules governing their behavior. And so, they're able to crash companies into the wall and make a ton of money. They're able to crash countries into the wall and make a ton of money. And actually, we need to legislate for that. We can't assume that our leadership class is necessarily well-intentioned or thinking, of the common good. But I think we can do that through institutions. And so that is a really fascinating, slightly sort of nerdy question that I'm pursuing these days.
Well, nerdy, but also one which is immensely pragmatic. So there's things I want to dig into what you've just been saying, but I suppose you've used this phrase, the 21st century organizational operating system. So what does that mean? How does an organization have an operating system? What can you sort of describe that metaphor? And what does that mean to bring it into one which is relevant today?
So I think, I would say two things. One thing is there's almost a sort of a metaphor in terms of evolution. If you look at management hierarchy, bureaucratic management, to me, that's the evolutionary equivalent of intelligent design. It's the idea that we have sort of, if you like, gods at the top and they can decide everything and cascade instructions down. Whereas what we really need in a period of change and volatility is we need evolutionary structures. They are responsive to change. They get stronger, in fact, the more predators and the more external influences they have. So for me, that's almost one metaphor to describe the shift from, vertically oriented structures to sort of, horizontally connected lateral structures. And I think it's a design pattern that we see everywhere. If you look at platforms and apps as a sort of a design pattern, it emerged on our phones. Now it's on our TVs. It's even in our cars. I have a home automation system which operates, in the same way. You control the rules of the road with the platform. You orchestrate your services through the platform, but then you create wonderful, specific and unique experiences with the variety of apps on top. So it's that sort of tight and loose combination, which I really like. So I think that's sort of generally where we're headed. But if you look at companies who are struggling to really get to grips with digital, I think what they have in common is that they don't really understand software, and they don't understand the history and almost the geology of software. Because if you look at software, 20 years ago, it looked like a bureaucratic hierarchy. It was vertically oriented, it was vertically integrated, and you would either use it or you'd throw it away and buy a new one. These days, most software is layered. You have all these different layers moving at different speeds, performing different functions, and it's also very service oriented. So we've seen the rise of microservices, we've seen the rise of sort of cloud computing platforms and so on. And really, for me, that's a reference architecture for the future institution and the future organization. And what I mean by that is that we need to take all of these manual processes that offices full of clerks and consultants and bookkeepers would perform, and we need to automate them. We need to turn them into services that sit within an organizational platform, so that we can create the freedom on top of that platform for people to be driven only by customer need, only by market opportunity, and to work in a much more agile way while still being coordinated, through the platform. So I think that's the first sort of point on the organizational operating system. But we also need to recognize that there is already an existing operating system in most organizations that consists of not just tech, but also culture, structure, the processes we use, the leadership models we use, and how we talk to each other, how we engage with each other. So I think what I'm interested in is to remove the need for sort of cascading hierarchy, to remove the need for manual process control, and to replace that with something that's really highly automated, very service oriented, and bits and pieces can be swapped out and developed, without throwing the whole model away, so that we can operate the cultural side of the operating system in a much more 21st century way. So agile, responsive, focus on employee engagement, focus on customer centricity, and a focus on interdisciplinary sort of innovation and mixing and matching between the different possibilities that this sort of system gives us. And I think what that would lead to, in my view, is organizations that look more like software and operate more like software. And so they're sort of naturally inclined to be more successful, in a world which is being sort of eaten by and led by software.
So trying to for a moment make this as tangible as possible. I mean, is there an example either of an organization which models that well, or ways in which we can see these being implemented in an organization? These kinds of software layers or platforms, or the, as you say, the modular web services approach. Can you give me examples to illustrate that?
Yes, I think it's easy to find these examples in the world of tech. So, in some respects, Amazon, is built on this sort of model with its small teams and its sort of common platform. You'll see elements of this in companies like Facebook and other tech companies. But I think what's most interesting is when you look outside tech and look for examples. And probably the best studied case study or example in the world today of this model is the Chinese firm Haier. This has been studied by Bill Fisher, by lots of people. And Haier have gone through 3-phase transformation. They began as a sort of classical state enterprise producing terrible quality products. They then switched to a sort of inverted pyramid where essentially all managers fled to the edges of the organization to hold on to customers and stay relevant. And so you have more power at the edges of Haier than you do at the center of Haier. And then they began their transition to a platform-based model where all of the common services from logistics, marketing, finance, they were all embedded in a shared service platform. Then the final stage of their transformation, which is the most interesting, was that individual teams went from being cost centers in a single organization to becoming basically micro enterprises. So there are now, within the Haier ecosystem and within the Haier brand, there are hundreds, probably thousands of individual micro enterprises who are all working on a common platform, to achieve shared goals, but they're pursuing their own fitness function, like, sort of evolutionary actors, if you like. And that's what gives them the real power. It's that sort of, it's almost like Adam Smith's sort of economic, theories. If all of these individual actors are pursuing their own fitness function in a connected evolutionary ecosystem, then actually you've created the conditions for emergence. You get a sum which is greater than the value of its parts, and you have a lot of overlap and redundancy, and you have fundamentally a healthy structure that's able to respond to challenges in one area, respond to opportunities in another. But everyone's always changing and everyone's always growing, and I think that's that's a model. It's not the only model, but I think that's a good reference architecture for what I'm describing. I think what people need to understand about that is it's also viciously competitive. So this is not a comfortable world of, here's your chair, eat your biscuits, sit there from 9 to 5 and you'll have a job, next year. It's more like you're always having to prove yourself. Your team's having to fight for its survival. And if you succeed, you'll have fantastic rewards. But if you don't, you'll fall by the wayside. So I think it's reasonable to be, honest and open about the fact that this has what you might think of for, let's say, European or even Australian, company cultures as having some negatives or some downsides.
So in this context of So this is the virtual excellence show. So the idea is this: with some organizations have already been completely virtual or significantly virtual, or very easy to shift from their current operating systems into a very virtual world. Others have been forced into it. And so in this idea of building this organizational operating system, what is the role, of course it depends on the organization, but what are the roles of the virtual work and communication and the role of the physical, and how does an organization design around the realities that you probably need both to whatever degree?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So we have a lot of lessons that we can draw from remote first organizations like GitHub, like Automatic. There's a ton of organizations. There's a ton of organizations who've used that model very successfully. So there's a lot we can learn from them. But I think the real change and the real transition that has to take place for the remote model to be successful is in how we do management. Because in a physical office-based company, managers have a physical presence, they have positional authority, they can own a meeting room, and sort of dominate the mindscape, if you like, of their workers and people in the room. But in the virtual world, actually, you're valued by your contributions and what you actually do. So what this has exposed for me is that a lot of managers don't really do what I would call work. They do a lot of talking, they do a lot of influencing, they do a lot of looking after themselves, but they don't write a bunch of stuff down. I live in Slack and wikis most of the time, and so I'm always producing, I'm writing, I'm creating, I'm connecting, I'm actually leaving artifacts behind that others can use. And that's not something that's the default setting actually for many managers, and that's why they've not always adopted the digital workplace, as well as their employees. And what you see now is that they're reverting to, meetings plus email as a way of staying relevant and staying in charge, which means Zoom calls or team calls or whatever platform you use. And that's having a real potentially negative effect on people's productivity and also their health. Because, the last thing you want to do is be sort of, stuck here in your home office on 8 hours of Zoom calls every day. That's not working. That's just sort of soul destroying. So I think managers, really have to reinvent their game, and they have to be contributors, lead from the front, connect, support, encourage, but not seek to dominate with their own authority. And so for me, the word remote is unfortunate because although we are physically remote, I'm 1,000 miles away from my nearest colleague at the moment. It's not about being remote. It's about online first. That's what we're talking about here is online first working. And that means, we should be connecting, we should be sharing, we should be writing things down, we should be, working in online systems fundamentally, not just exchanging emails and attending meetings. So that's the big shift that has to happen. And if you make that shift, then you achieve some amazing progress because you've made middle management a whole lot less necessary and relevant. So that's going to save a ton of cost. You've also made everyone else more productive because they're not spending half their time, reporting to someone about what they've done, because what they've done is visible, it's on the system and everyone can see it. And also you've created the possibility of connecting teams and connecting workers in a smarter way, because it's about networks, it's about online systems and platforms. So I think that's how I see it. But we need to learn a whole series of sort of collaboration skills that I think many of us have had for a long time, but mainstream managers don't have. So we need to understand the different speeds of collaboration. Not everything needs to be real time in Slack. Some things should be semi-synchronous. Some things should be completely asynchronous, where people need to do deep work. And also collaboration at different levels of scale, because with my core team, maybe 10, 15 people, yes, we can work in Slack very effectively, but you can't do that at the departmental level. You can't do that at the next level of scale. You need enterprise social networks, or you need other sharing platforms. And then when you look at the organization as a whole, well, it's just too many people to get to know. And so really what that is more like a public realm. It's, you can find things, you can search, you can get hold of people. But when you find them, you then need to go into a more intimate, smaller scale collaboration environment in order to get things done. So, different speeds, different scales of collaboration demand different techniques, different management techniques, and also different tools. And this is a set of skills that's come, despite our best efforts over the last 10 or 20 years, this has come as quite a surprise to many leaders and managers today.
So for those leaders that have been surprised and said, we need to change, we need to educate our managers, we need new tools, so on. So what's the process? Of course, again, every organization is different, but what's a roadmap for leaders that wake up and say, all right, I understand, beginning to understand things are virtual, we need to do this online first, we need the skills to be able to collaborate and work together in that space, we need the tools and the process to support that. What does that journey look like? Where do you start? What goes on after that?
I think, the first step, I do quite a lot of leadership development work at the moment and exec ed, in different contexts. And I think the first step usually is to recognize that your role as a leader in the online world and the networked world is about being a context setter, and a supporter and a curator of the experience of work and the structures of work. So you need to think a little bit like an organizational architect in terms of optimizing the way of working for your teams and how they interface with others and how they connect. And secondly, you need to be a bit more of a coach rather than a controller. We've said for more years than I can count that trust is cheaper than control as a management system. So if you're hiring the best people and you're giving them the tools and connecting them, you don't need to then treat them like 6-year-olds and badger them to do tidy their bedroom and then tell them off when their numbers are too low. They know when their numbers are too low. You need to help them find solutions. So I think the role of leadership and management changes a bit, but let's be honest, the best leaders have always operated like this. It's just that we've got used to a whole layer of mediocrity, that shares a title with the best leaders, but really isn't delivering value for anyone except themselves in many cases. So that's the first step. I think the second step is realizing that you're also responsible for the tools and the systems that people use. And so that should be a key focus in getting the best systems and tools for your teams. And then also, I think, understand that, what we need is sort of agile leadership. So, don't have the 100-page plan and then lead people on a death march via Gantt charts towards its implementation, but sense and respond, get feedback, be sensitive to external information and keep shifting and tweaking the way we get to that destination or the way we pursue that direction, based on that. And that also needs becoming multimodal. A trendy concept in the last 5 years in leadership education has been ambidextrous leadership. Know when to exploit and run the system, and know when to explore and innovate and create new processes. But I think it's not just binary. I think there are many modes of leadership, and recognizing when to apply each mode is really a key leadership sort of intelligence. Rather than just assuming that you can do the command and control thing over and over again. So, it's entirely possible. The other thing is that I've noticed is that many managers in large organizations have become sort of generic management meats, if you like. They, at one point, they had a specialization. They were a whizzy finance controller or a designer or a developer. But what the management system does is it tries to turn you into a generic political figure that just knows how to manipulate other people, essentially. And so part of it means getting back in touch with the actual skills and passions that these people had that got them where they are in the first place. And, and recognize that their role is not just to be generic managers, but it's to be smart contributors and lead from the front. And I think where people do that, you can have a very positive relationship with employees, and you can make a very positive case for the added value that kind of leadership does bring. Because I do still believe in some very traditional leadership strengths and attributes, and I think they are proven, in organizations when people have the freedom to compete and do their best work.
So do you think that how fast do you think organizations are changing? Have you seen in your experience or the organizations you work with that there are some that have managed to really accelerate their change to understand these issues of building these organizational operating systems and putting that in place and shifting cultures? Obviously some haven't, but I mean, what sort of pace have you seen in terms of this ability to shift?
I think the pace has picked up, and I think one of the reasons has been the shift to online first working, because we had digital workplace technologies. Let's say a sort of middle of the road solution is Microsoft 365 and that platform, which is growing and evolving quite quickly. So typically lots of organizations had that, but it wasn't really the place where work happened. It was a place where we talked about work, and the work happened in meeting rooms and over email and all the rest of it. Now, obviously, COVID's changed the game, and so now this has become the center of the workplace and where work happens. And so lots of IT departments have had to, put a lot of work in actually to beefing up the platform, hardening it, scaling it, providing better access to it, etc. And they are starting, I think, to now regard this as a core platform within the organization. So I have seen some really encouraging progress on the technology level within enterprises. But what I haven't yet seen is enough understanding at the leadership and management level about, what algorithmic or automated, work management looks like, how that changes the role of the hierarchy, and how they can do all this stuff at a much, much lower cost level than they're used to in the past. Take away the buildings, take away the legions of middle managers that sort of occupy them and run around them, and you can save a ton of money. Now, that's not to say that we don't need physical interaction or physical workplaces. I think what we are seeing is a shift to the office as like a clubhouse. So it's a place where you can come together, with teams or with larger groups. You can do the creative stuff, you can do the workshops, you can get to know each other, but you don't need to just sit in that seat every day, and you certainly don't need to travel an hour both ends of the day, to get there. So I think we definitely need physical interaction. It's very hard to onboard people or get to know people or build a sort of esprit de corps, without hanging out together and sort of sniffing each other and seeing each other in close quarters. And I think the best remote companies, what they also do is they do sort of quarterly offsites. Everyone goes to Bali or everyone goes to Paris or wherever it might be. And, they have a shared experience, which can sustain more remote contact, for 6 months easily, beyond that. So I think, the shift is happening. I think some organizations are grappling with this. I think, to be fair to IT, it seems to be more driven by the technologists at the moment than it is by the managers and the leaders. But, that penny will also drop. And partly it's going to be forced on people because, we need to reduce our cost base. We need to look at our real estate. We need to look at our sort of management headcount. Because it's not only expensive, but it's also holding us back in many areas. So I think these are the imperatives that will drive that change in the next period. So I guess, against all my better judgment, I'm slightly optimistic.
Well, that's a great point to wrap up. And just coming back to the beginning, this idea of what you said, back from originally this mission to be able to help organizations to have a positive impact, I suppose, more broadly. And so looking forward in terms of your work and I suppose what you're seeing going on in the world, I mean, in that optimistic frame, where could we go? Or where do we see the next years in terms of being able to implement these real relevant organizational operating systems for today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, why am I interested in how humans come together to achieve common purpose? Well, I think it's just one of the most fascinating questions that touches on psychology, it touches on biology, it touches on history, evolution, organizational theory, organizational design. And, we live in a non-linear exponential world today. So small organizations, small cities, small nations can have an outsized impact if they manage their relations and their networks and their ecosystems, in a very clever way. And they become attractors of talent and attractors of capital even. So the question's changing, and the possibilities are changing. I hope to be, an e-resident of somewhere like Estonia, who is also a physical citizen of Apple, and they provide all of my sort of life supporting services and data and privacy and so on. And maybe, I form my own micronation, which is sort of a networked bunch across, 5 time zones. I mean, these are the sort of possibilities that I can see in the future in terms of, belonging, and in terms of finding, your people, your network with whom you can pursue, common goals. So that to me is really exciting. And I think the same thing can happen for companies as well. So organizations can achieve that kind of rapid spread, network virality, all these kind of things, if they have the right sort of culture and DNA and drivers at the center. So, that's why I'm optimistic. And I think that's where we're headed. We're not looking at a world of hard borders in countries, hard borders in companies, big physically dominating offices in the city. We're looking at porous membranes, as Human Cloud used to enjoy writing cartoons about. We're looking at ecosystems. We're looking at sort of knowing what your center is, but not knowing where the edges stop, and sort of bleeding out into the activities of others. And that, for me, from a biological sort of evolutionary history point of view, that's sort of like where Kevin Kelly's thesis comes in, that actually technology is a subset of human evolution. And actually, we're sort of moving together into the future, with a mixed sort of human machine outlook. And yeah, I think that's probably where we're headed. And it's not a bad place to go, as long as we can do that driven by, very human, positive values.
Absolutely. And a lot of what you're saying, as echoes my work in transcending boundaries for organizations and value creation. And that's why I think that the virtual excellent theme is so important, because that is one of the enablers for us to be able to create value across boundaries. So thank you so much for sharing your insights today, Lee, and very certainly wish you great success and be able to pursue your vision of being able to help many organizations and institutions implement the 21st century organizational operating systems that will create a better future for all of us.
Thanks, Ross. It's been really good talking to you, and I really appreciate the support.
Thank you, Lee. That was Lee Bryant. So he is helping many organizations around the world implement 21st century organizational operating systems, which is going to be key to our future. So if you've liked the episode, please like the show on YouTube. Subscribe if you liked more of this. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Have a wonderful day.